All right, so we're live, and it's a June edition of It Depends Economic Version. I'm here today with our head economist at the Calgary Real Estate Board, Anne-Marie Laurie. She's been gracious enough to tell the biblical tale that I've been telling now, the mantra, for well over a year. We're going to talk a little bit today about how statistics influence, the economic outlook on multiple sectors. Primarily, we're going to look at the real estate market, but we're really going to talk about how statistics sort of connect the dots when we look at economic pressures and how that influences the housing market. Is that fair to?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Mm-hmm.
So I've got a list of questions here today that I'm going to ask Anne-Marie, and I could explain it, but I would prefer that the gospel comes, the truth as it were. Anne-Marie and I actually did our undergrads together, and she's gone on and has been the main knowledge for the real estate board. So, we're looking at stats, how can we use statistics to answer the common questions that realtors are asked, namely, how's the market?
Right, and that's where you have to look at and assess, first of all, what is the market you're looking at? Because how the market is, that's really broad. So using stats is saying, okay, well, let's look at stats to see how is a specific segment of the market. So let's look at detached, let's look at apartments, let's look at townhouse or row or different product tiles. And because if you're using general stats, it's not going to give you a picture. I mean, it might tell you what the entire market is, but it's not going to tell you what a specific house is doing or what a neighborhood is doing.
Sure.
So that's where the stats come in, and actually the ability to look at it on a more of a micro level versus just looking at an overall broad base.
Okay. And with that, would you tie in like price as well, like pricing segments of the marketplace?
Yeah, and there's some very common stats too. So you have to understand really what stats do you look at. Like, I mean, if you have to narrow it down on housing stats, some of the key things I'd look at is sales.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Well, that's kind of a reflection of what your demand is in the market.
Sure.
So that's sales activity is one thing to look at. Another level is looking at the inventories. You have to know how much product and how much supply is in the market. And price is really, it's more about price changes for me than an actual price. But movements in price are really affected by that supply-demand balance.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of simple in one sense, and yet we somehow make it a little bit more complicated than what it needs to be.
Well, there's a lot of things that influence those sales numbers. There's a lot of things that influence inventory, and there's things that influence price beyond that. So if you think about sales, well, what influences sales?
Mm-hmm.
Economic indicators. So if people are working, so employment, right? Employment, unemployment, those things kind of impact their sales activity. Confidence in the market also impacts sales. If you have to think about things like interest rates,
mm-hmm.
well, changes in interest rates and higher rates, that impacts people's ability to purchase. So that also impacts that demand in the market. So all of those things combined will influence. So there is more to it. It's just about what is driving those changes. Inventories, now we have to think it's not just the supply coming on from people listing their homes.
Mm-hmm.
It's also inventory that may be influenced by other aspects of the market. So rental inventories, new home inventories, all of that kind of plays into the total supply picture for housing.
Yeah. Just to quickly touch on it, where do you see the rental market in terms of inventory, and do you see that due to the lending rule changes that more people are choosing to stay in the rental market, or do you see that this may be a time for them to be jumping out and looking at possibly purchasing?
I think we're in a market right now that because you've had changes, you've had 3 rate increases, you have stricter qualification, that's intended to keep people in rental longer. And it's going to make it harder for people to move into ownership.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think that's going to change that rental versus ownership sort of outlook on things. Now, at the same time, people do eventually switch to ownership. Usually that'll have to come with price, like you'll start to see some of that shift go into apartment condos at some point,
mm-hmm.
because prices have been falling in that market, and that can start to encourage people to really look at, well, what's my cost of rental versus my cost of ownership.
Mm-hmm.
Over the past several years, a lot of people have viewed it as particularly with rent levels dropping, is there hasn't been a real push to go into ownership.
With the maybe the higher with tenants now staying where they are, do you foresee then that rents will probably start to migrate north up a little bit, and then that in turn will start to push people into that ownership?
Eventually.
Okay.
So there's two things that have, well, first of all, they have to work through the additional rental supply. There still is a lot of rental product available.
Mm-hmm.
Now, different price ranges, of course, but there is still that rental supply. So once those vacancies start to come down, then you can start to see potentials for rent increases. And yes, as rentals start to increase and there's less supply choice in the rental market, then you can see people move to ownership. On the other hand, even if people are renting, if ownership prices drop enough, and some of the kind of what you traditionally view it as the first time segment of the market, then you could see people also making that switch.
Right.
Yeah.
Maybe switch gears a little bit. Let's talk about, you were talking about supply and inventory and sales. What are the months of supply that we have in the real estate market right now in Calgary and surrounding areas, and how do we determine that months of supply, and how is that a good indicator on how we should sort of be forecasting and how we would guide our clients on terms of position to price?
Okay, so months of supply, first of all, what is it? Well, it really is just the amount of inventory in the market divided by the sales in any specific month.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you look at it on a monthly basis. Here's the inventory stock divided by the sales in that month, and you'll get a number for months of supply. Now, why is that important? Well, again, inventory really reflects your supply in the market, and the sales reflects your demand. So it's almost that measure of how much demand is there based off of the supply in the market.
Mm-hmm.
So if this number is really high, so if you get like a 10-month of supply or something like that, then that tells you there's a lot more supply than demand in the market. And that tends to push down prices.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it doesn't happen instantaneously. 1 month of that number is not going to automatically cause prices to fall. But if this is something that's fairly persistent and continues for several months at a time, then it starts to influence pricing. Okay, now, so that's the basis of why we use it. It's a very good indicator on what can happen with prices. Now, where it sits right now is it has been rising. Because we've had two things happen. We've had sales fall in our market, so that we haven't had as strong a sales activity, and it's lower than previous years. So when you look at sales, you can't just look at year-over-year changes. Keep in mind from where we are based off historical levels. And we haven't seen, and sales activity have been low across all product types.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, inventories haven't come off. So I often talk about how is supply adjusting to demand. Right now, supply is staying high. It's not adjusting to the levels of demand in the market. So what happens is our months of supply increase. So right now, we're sitting with months of supply in the apartment sector at over 7 months. That would be high
Mm-hmm.
for an apartment style product. So that's been causing price declines. And this isn't something that's new. This really started a few years ago and it's continuing. So we've had elevated levels of months of supply for apartment condominiums for some time now. And we can see it in pricing. So prices since the peak of the market in 2014 for apartment condos have dropped by 14%. Right? That is a reflection of just too much supply based off the demand in the market. Now, recently we have seen some of those detached months of supply also rise.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because inventory levels and new listings continue to increase. And at the same time, sales just haven't been. Now, there's many reasons why detached sales have come off. In part, we think some of that is to do with changes in the lending rates. You've had 3 increases, you have stricter qualifications. This has pulled some people out of the market. So that has reduced demand, and at the same time, though, supply hasn't adjusted. New listings continue to improve. Supply levels are still remaining somewhat elevated, and our months of supply is pushing above 4 months. Now in Calgary, for the detached market, based off historical levels, that is fairly high.
Yeah, we were sitting around just under 2.5 months last year.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So it is a lot. Now last year it did get a little tighter than anybody expected at this time. But
Yep.
I mean, when you're over 4, that is for our market specifically. Mm-hmm. That does tend to be a bit higher, and we're starting to see an impact in pricing because this has been now a few months of this going on, and prices just haven't been able to move. So prices are currently sitting at levels just slightly below what we had last year. when we look at that typical home price.
Yeah. So talk a little bit about the key economic indicators right now and some of the things that, whether or not the market is up or down, but, specifically what's affecting, what's suppressing our market right now? Like, what are the top three suppressors that, if we can, climb out of that we'll probably start to see some daylight?
Well, the first thing is the market's adjusting. So the market is adjusting to the new lending rule changes. That is fairly significant. Not only, we have to think rates haven't been as high as we've seen right now in almost a decade. So that is a big adjustment for a lot of people out there. So you've got the higher rates. Now you have to qualify at a much higher rate. You're qualifying at over 5.5%. So that's an adjustment. And our incomes haven't kept pace. So that's the first thing. Now, to offset that, you would need to see changes in your economic climate. So while our economy is getting better, it's starting to grow, it's not growing enough. It's not resulting in significant changes in employment. So yes, our employment has gotten a little bit better, but we're not creating the higher paid jobs that we're used to seeing. Right, so this recovery has been very different in that most of the job growth has not been the same as the jobs that were lost, right? So that is part of it. So unemployment rates still remain a little high. So, and because we're not creating higher paid jobs, it's really difficult to attract migrants into the city. So what do we need to see change? Well, we need to see some better jobs come back. We need to see those unemployment rates continue to decline, and we need to see migrants come back to the city.
Sure.
So we need to see a turnaround in that migration number. Now, it wasn't negative in Calgary last year, but it was 900 migrants. That's not a lot of migrants considering we're used to having at least 15,000. So that is part of it. And as migrants do come in, then that can help. Right? So that helps get rid of that excess supply in the market. So
say, for instance, that tomorrow, the buzzword right now is obviously the pipeline and the jobs that it's going to create. Fast forward that to when and if that's actually happening. Today, the unemployment level, it gets virtually wiped out again. Calgary's back to a rah-rah kind of state. How long typically do we look to see that money come back into the economy? People need to save up and, for a down payment on major purchases. What's that time frame from the time that people are, okay, I'm now stable economically, from there, fast forward, how long till they're typically looking to purchase?
You can't say clearly how long that's going to be. And you have to keep in mind that even if certain things like that, like a pipeline happens, it still comes down to what types of jobs are being created. Because there's temporary jobs versus permanent jobs. Right now, that being said, assuming that the economy does start doing better, people start getting back on their feet, usually before that turns into purchases, I would say that there's a timeline to that. So you need at least several quarters before you start to see it reflected in some of the numbers.
Sure.
And especially given what we're seeing now regarding the impact on qualification, you could see that timeline change. So we could see that it moved from what it was traditionally 2 to 3 quarters, move into something more like 4 to 8 quarters before we start to see it really reflect in the market.
Yep, I would agree with that. Which probably segues into our last question here. You've got your crystal ball out, and we don't hold you to anything. But what are the expectations of the Calgary market in the next 6 months to a year, and how is that different from the forecast that was done in January?
Well, in the forecast in January, we highlighted a lot of risks. So we weren't expecting any growth this year. So let's be clear on that. We weren't expecting sales activity to be strong. We knew that there was some supply issues. And with the lending rule changes that were coming, we knew this would take some of that demand off the market. But the economy was expected to improve. Now, that being said, we haven't seen that same pickup in the economy enough. We haven't seen those levels pick up enough to really prevent some of the price easing that we're seeing right now. So we'll be doing a full update on our forecast soon. But until then, some of the things that I just haven't seen happen is I haven't seen a real turnaround in terms of employment yet. If that does start to happen, that can help offset some of these changes in the lending market. but we just have still too much supply, so I just don't expect to see, I mean, you could see some prices ease a bit this year, further.
Yeah.
I mean, we were already expecting that for apartment condos, let's be clear.
Yeah.
But it's really more the detached, and that tends to be where people focus their attention because it is the majority of our market. So we could see some further easing of detached prices this year. But you got to keep some perspective. I mean, you know, oftentimes when people hear prices falling, they jump to a conclusion of how much of a fall.
Yeah.
We're not talking I am not expecting a very large decrease. I'm just expecting a gradual downward trend.
Yeah.
Because as economic conditions do start to improve, it should stop some of that. Okay,
Yeah.
so we might see those start to level off. We do anticipate that the supply will start to adjust to the lowered levels of demand. So if demand stays this low, we do expect to see some of the level of listings come off. Some of that inventory on the resale side start to come off if people can't get the prices that they expect.
Yeah.
So we do expect that, but it's not going to create any growth. So we just don't expect that growth this year. And we could have some downside risk on the pricing, particularly in the detached. We already expected that in the apartment.
Yeah. No, I think that's some great information that you've provided. You know, I would tend to always lean more towards, you know, factual information as opposed to, you know, our initial spring market was too cold. And, you know, now we've got Stampede coming up and there's too many functions to go to. So, you know, there's always an excuse to be had, but I think it's more important to look at the economic variables and the statistics that you put out for the realtors. So with that, I really appreciate your time and hope that our audience takes that to heart and they've learned a little bit. And by all means, should you have more questions, give your favorite realtor a call. Hopefully that's me. And until next month, enjoy the rest of the summer or the start of the summer, and we'll talk soon.